Okay, let's see.
Number 14, the fossil footstep. A hammer comes down on a gray slab in the Utah desert. The rock opens like a book. Inside is the outline of a sandal, not a vague smudge or a random stain. A shape with a heel, a taper, even crushed trilobites caught beneath it, as if someone stepped through mud and walked away 500 million years ago. On June 1st, 1968, near Antelope Springs, fossil hunter William J. Meister said that is exactly what he found in Cambrian rock from the Wheeler Formation. If he was right, the timeline of humanity does not bend, it shatters. The problem follows every clue in this story. When something appears impossible, do we dismiss it because it is false, or because we no longer know how to recognize the artificial when it has been buried long enough to look natural? The footprint that tried to put humans in the Cambrian. Meister was not a university paleontologist. He was an amateur collector from Kearns, Utah, out near a fossil site about 43 miles northwest of Delta. The story did not begin in a lab. It began with one man in the desert, splitting stone where trilobites are common, looking for ancient sea life, and finding what looked like a modern piece of footwear. The image barely needed help. A sandal-like print in Cambrian rock is already cinematic. Then come the trilobites inside the mark. Real trilobites, from rock usually described as around 500 million years old. At that point, the object starts making its own case. No engines, no cities, no metal. Just one step. One human-shaped intrusion in the wrong layer. One collision between deep time and something with a heel. In 1968, Meister published the specimen in the Creation Research Society Quarterly. By 1970, chemist Melvin A. Cook was using it as evidence against evolution. The slab crossed a line fast. It was no longer a curiosity from Antelope Springs. It became an out-of-place artifact, then a weapon in a much larger fight about history, geology, and whether the official timeline had missed something enormous. The argument around the print took on a peculiar shape. The strongest defenders kept pointing to the trilobites, because trilobites made the setting ancient. The strongest critics spent little time denying the trilobites at all. They accepted the fossils as genuine. What they challenged was the border around them, the supposed sandal itself. That makes this clue more interesting than a simple fake. If someone had carved a footprint into the slab, the case would be dull. If the fossils had been planted, it would be dull in a different way. Most skeptical analyses say neither happened. The ancient part is real, the human part is a misreading. The eye sees a shoe because the rock split in a suggestive way. A real human footprint should give you more, even through a shoe. Weight distribution, toe direction, anatomical asymmetry, pressure differences from heel strike to push-off. The Meister specimen gives an oblong shape with a narrowing end and a line across the back that was described as heel wear. To a non-specialist, that sounds persuasive. To a geologist, it sounds suspiciously theatrical. The heel is the first problem. Critics noted that the heel-like boundary is not a worn edge from a sandal pressing into mud. It appears to be a crack running across the slab and continuing beyond the alleged print. The detail that makes the object look most manufactured may be the one feature least tied to a foot. The outline has its own problems. It lacks convincing footprint anatomy. What it does have is the kind of clean, simplified silhouette that human pattern recognition loves. We are very good at turning fragments into intention, faces in clouds, animals in constellations, ruins in bedrock, a shoe in a broken rock, especially when a trilobite underneath seems to certify an impossible age. There was another complication in the geology. The Wheeler Formation produces thin-bedded rock that can break along natural plains. When those layers split, they can leave shapes that look deliberate. Geologists call one relevant process spalling. Rock surfaces flake or separate in ways that create crisp outlines and nested forms. Not because anyone stepped there, because stone fails along its own weaknesses. That explanation is almost too mundane for the image it has to defeat. A sandal in Cambrian mud is vivid. Spalling is not. One gives you a vanished world, the other gives you fracture mechanics. Myth gets the better poster. The fossil content kept working for the myth. Skeptical writers identified the trilobites in the specimen as Elrathia kingi, a real Cambrian species common to the area. That should have narrowed the claim. Instead, it widened it. Once the fossils were accepted as authentic, the whole slab felt authenticated by association. Ancient fossils below, modern-looking print above, therefore ancient print. That leap is the entire engine. This is the first trap in the larger question. If a civilization before recorded history really did leave traces behind, we would need to be careful not to throw them away as natural accidents. The reverse danger is just as real. Once an object carries one indisputable sign of age, people start granting age and intention to everything touching it. So what about the crushed trilobites inside the print, the detail that made this slab famous in the first place? They do not prove a human sandal pressed them into Cambrian mud. They prove trilobites were in the rock before the rock split. In the skeptical reading, the fossils are part of the original fossil-bearing layer, and the footprint is a later pattern created when the slab fractured and spalled along that layer. The trilobites were not stepped on by a Cambrian human. They were exposed by a break. That is why the specimen still matters. Not because it puts people 500 million years back. Not because the trilobites were fake. It matters because a real fossil bed and a natural crack produced something persuasive enough to enter anti-evolution literature within 2 years of being found. The print's most famous feature, the crushed heel line, runs past the print as a crack. Number 13. Dinosaur Road. How many numbers does it take to make a person out of mud and stone? One print, 16 inches long, a stride of 54 inches, a river in Texas, and more than 100 million years of credibility borrowed from the wrong tracks. In 1909, near Glen Rose, a local boy named George Adams noticed strange marks in a tributary of the Paluxy after erosion peeled back Cretaceous limestone. The stone was old in the plain geological sense, not mythically old, but dated old. About 107 million years by the American Museum of Natural History, about 113 million by Texas Park Materials. The marks were not vague. They were footprints, huge ones, three-toed theropods, rounder sauropod impressions, actual dinosaur trackways pressed into soft sediment and turned to rock. That first number mattered. Not one suspicious shape, but a real surface covered in real tracks. Then a longer, smoother impression appeared among them, and the setting did half the work. If genuine dinosaurs had crossed this riverbed, and something human-shaped seemed to cross it too, the leap was easy. In 1917, Southern Methodist University geologist Ellis W. Schuler published the first scientific description of the Glen Rose dinosaur tracks. By 1933, slabs from the riverbed were being cut out for display. Some went to museums, some fed roadside fascination. The Paluxy became both a fossil site and a stage set. A place with no authentic tracks would have been easy to dismiss. A place with excellent dinosaur tracks let weaker claims borrow the weight of stronger ones. Now narrow the field to one alleged human trail, a set of elongated depressions later promoted as the Taylor Trail. The reported averages sounded neat enough to spread: 16 inches per print, 54 inches per stride. Large, but not absurdly large. Big enough to suggest a giant human, or a very large ancient man, depending on the storyteller. Small enough to picture. That is where the story turns. Real dinosaur tracks made fake humans look possible. In the 1970s, Stanley Taylor turned those marks into a visual argument in the film Footprints in Stone. The proposition was simple enough to survive bad photography, and repeated often enough to survive scrutiny. Humans and dinosaurs had walked here together, not in separate ages, not in separate sediments, side by side. For anyone looking for proof that conventional prehistory was deeply wrong, Paluxy was perfect. No buried city, no mysterious alloy, just mud, stone, and an outline with a heel. One print, in particular, kept the claim alive. It had a rounded back, a narrowed middle, and a front that seemed to taper the way a giant barefoot human print might. It looked less like a clawed foot than the others, less obviously reptilian. In still images, under selective light, it could seem almost embarrassingly direct. Some claims are so complicated they collapse under their own weight. This one fit in a photograph. Photographs, though, are easy to flatter and hard to trust. Start with anatomy. A theropod track is not always just 3 toes and a neat heel. In soft mud, more of the foot can sink in. The metatarsal section can contact the ground. That changes the shape. What should look like a 3-toed impression can stretch backward into a longer, more human-looking form. Then sediment settles into the deeper parts. The edges blur. Then, erosion takes over. The river abrades the exposed surface and shaves away the details that would have made the original track easy to classify. What is left can be an outline that tells the truth badly. By the 1980s, investigators were measuring the claims the way a paleontologist measures anything else: depth, spacing, toe traces, substrate, infill, cross-section. Glenn Kubin was central here. What matters is not only that he rejected the man-track claim. Kubin himself believed in a creator. The case did not collapse along a tidy believers versus scientists line. It collapsed under closer looking. In 1986, Kubin's work helped show that the Taylor site man tracks were mostly infilled dinosaur tracks, erosion marks, or altered impressions. The most famous examples did not hold together equally well. Some lacked anatomical detail where detail should have survived. Some matched elongated dinosaur prints once lighting and surface wear were accounted for. And the best so-called man track in the literature, the Morris print, was identified in a Journal of Geological Education article as carved. That is, the arithmetic of the site. One genuine dinosaur trackway, more than 100 million years old. One alleged human trail with convenient average dimensions. Several ambiguous shapes. At least one carved showpiece. A river that covers the bed, exposes it, silts it over, and exposes it again. Each cycle changes the exhibit. So the apparently human print from the beginning does have an answer. It was not a barefoot witness from impossible antiquity. It came from dinosaur foot anatomy meeting soft mud, then infilling, then erosion, then photography that favored silhouette over structure. Officially, the Paluxy River tracks are a paleontological treasure from the early Cretaceous. In practice, for decades, that same riverbed produced museum-grade dinosaur evidence on one slab and sermon-grade human evidence on the next. Number 12. Carved dinosaurs. In 1966, in Ica, a desert city on Peru's southern coast, a museum of stones began to promise something almost impossible. Every forbidden theory already illustrated, every missing chapter of history neatly engraved and ready for display. Physician Javier Cabrera Darquilla received a dark stone as a birthday gift. It fit in one hand. The surface was blackened and smooth. Cut into it was an animal he identified as an extinct fish. That one cobble became the beginning of the story. Cabrera started looking. One stone became dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. As the collection grew, the images seemed almost too accommodating. Dinosaurs with riders on their backs, men performing surgery, astronomers with telescopes, maps of vanished lands, flying machines. The museum built around them did not feel like a room of ambiguous artifacts. It felt like a complete visual argument. If recorded history had missed something enormous, here it was, carved into andesite and lined up in cases. One image kept returning because it landed hardest. A reptile with a heavy tail, a ridged back, jaws open in profile, and a human figure beside it or on it. Not just an animal, a dinosaur. Not just coexistence, but familiar coexistence, staged and easy to read, as if some ancient witness had stopped long enough to sketch a diagram. If an advanced civilization really existed before recorded history, would we recognize its remains as artificial, or mistake them for myth dressed up as evidence? In Ica, the stones seemed to give a clear reply. They gave believers an instant picture stronger than any excavation record. Cabrera was not an obscure villager passing along folklore. He was a trained doctor, educated and articulate, exactly the kind of advocate a story like this needed. The stones were said to come from around Acucaje, about 40 kilometers south of Ica, from tombs and old burials disturbed in the desert. That detail mattered. A carved oddity in a curio shop is one thing. A carved oddity from a grave is evidence. Cabrera built his claim on that difference. These were not isolated decorations, he argued. They were the surviving record of a lost, prehistoric civilization, a stone library. The collection kept expanding, and the numbers themselves became part of the performance. The Cabrera Museum today says it exhibits 11,000 stones. Broader counts often place the claimed total around 20,000. In a glass case, one strange object invites doubt. In room after room, thousands begin to feel like confirmation. Quantity starts to imitate authority. But then the confidence of the pictures began to break under closer looking. Many dinosaur scenes did not resemble glimpses from deep antiquity. They resembled 20th century dinosaur art, copied onto stone. Upright tails, familiar comic book poses, textbook monsters popular in the middle of the century. A genuine ancient witness would not be expected to repeat the mistakes of modern illustration, yet these carvings often did. They looked less like lost memory than recycled imagery. The story then moved from wonder to transaction. The most important name was Basilio Ushuaia, a local farmer who became one of Cabrera's main suppliers. The stones did not simply appear in museum drawers. They moved through hands, through sales, through a regional trade linking huaqueros, tourists, collectors, and believers. Imagine the moment at a roadside table. A dark stone lifted into sunlight, a buyer turning it over, seeing a dinosaur and a human on the same surface, and deciding within seconds that he was holding proof. The same object could be sold as a souvenir or as a weapon against the accepted timeline. In 1977, the story met a camera. BBC coverage carried the Ica Stones to a much wider audience, but exposure cut both ways. Under scrutiny, Ushuaia admitted that he made engraved stones himself. In skeptical accounts of the filming, he described using modern tools and methods to age them artificially before selling them. The scene changes at that point. The issue is no longer whether the carvings are shocking. It is whether shock was the product, and the product was effective because it was visual. One dinosaur and one human on the same stone could do more persuasive work in a second than pages of careful archaeological reporting. That is how the stones spread through ancient astronaut circles and creationist literature in the 1970s. They did not need context to travel. They needed only to be seen. Cabrera did not retreat. He insisted his collection contained genuine ancient records, and that confessions from local makers explained only part of the material. That resistance opened a more dangerous problem than simple fakery. Once a collection is contaminated at scale, a few authentic objects can be swallowed by thousands of modern inventions, and then every label starts to wobble. A real pre-Columbian engraved stone, if one existed among them, would not rescue the archive. It would make the archive harder to sort, harder to trust, and easier for both believers and skeptics to misuse. That is the risk fraud creates after the confession. It does not only fool buyers, it muddies the record itself. A museum drawer can hold modern cuts beside older stones. A dramatic fake can attract more attention than a genuine object ever would. And when the public learns that some pieces were manufactured for sale, doubt spreads outward beyond the hoax. Viewers stop asking only whether these stones are false. They start wondering whether archaeology is simply choosing which stories to believe. In 2006, investigators writing for Skeptical Inquirer visited Cabrera's museum and examined stones under magnification. Their conclusion was blunt. The engravings appeared modern. The incisions looked fresh. No documented excavation tied the famous dinosaur scenes to controlled finds. Under magnification, the authority of the images collapsed into lines cut too recently, on surfaces too convenient, with stories too eager to be true. Yet that did not end the case. In a way, it explained why the stones lasted. Fake evidence survives when it does something real evidence often cannot. It offers an immediate picture, a complete world already assembled, with no patience required and no ambiguity allowed. And that is the larger threat waiting beyond Ica. Once people learn to trust the picture more than the provenience, a forgery does not need to beat archaeology. It only needs to look clearer than the record. Number 11. The clay jar. In 1936, in the low ground of Kujut Rabu near Baghdad, excavators pulled up a small clay vessel from a Parthian-era context. It stood only about 13 centimeters tall, roughly 5.5 inches. Inside, it looked stranger than it did from the outside. A rolled copper cylinder, an iron rod, and a bitumen plug sealing the top. If you saw only the cross-section, stripped of the dirt and the date, you could mistake it for something familiar, a battery that may never have powered a single machine. 2 years later, in 1938, Wilhelm Koenig of the Iraq Museum looked at those parts and made the leap that gave the object its modern fame. Maybe this was not storage at all. Maybe it was a galvanic cell. The logic was clean and tempting. 2 different metals inside a container, sealed with insulating material, with just enough room for an acidic liquid like vinegar or wine. To anyone living after Volta, the arrangement almost announces itself. That is the trap. The jar does not just look old. It looks as if it slipped in from the wrong story. If an advanced civilization had existed before recorded history, would we recognize its remains as artificial? Or would we sort them away as temples, rocks, myths, and odd chemistry? In this case, the chemistry seems to look straight back at us. Researchers built replicas, fill them with an electrolyte, and they produce a small voltage. Not much, but enough to register. Enough to light up documentaries. Enough to make the object feel less like a museum curiosity and more like a survivor from a lost technical tradition. You can watch the idea grow from there. One jar becomes several. Several become a method. A method becomes an industry no one wrote down. But an artifact is not a system. A copper cylinder and an iron rod can show that something existed in one vessel, in one place, sometime between roughly 250 BCE and 650 CE. They do not, by themselves, prove workshops, users, standardized production, training, repairs, or purpose. A real machine belongs to an ecosystem. It leaves conductors, terminals, repeated designs, debris, instructions, accidents, imitations. Technology rarely appears as a single, lonely object that happens to flatter a modern analogy. It leaves fingerprints everywhere. Here, those fingerprints are missing. There are no confirmed ancient wires attached to these vessels. No switches, no lamps, no text explaining electrical use. No cache of unmistakably electroplated objects from the same context that forces the interpretation into place. And the replica experiments, persuasive as they look on camera, carry a quiet circularity. First, the object is imagined as a battery. Then, it is rebuilt to behave like one. Then the successful reconstruction is used as evidence that the first guess was right. A rival explanation sounds less glamorous, which is usually why it gets less attention. The copper tube and iron rod may have been part of a container for sacred scrolls or other stored material. Bitumen-sealed assemblies are not absurd in that role. They fit a world of preservation better than a world of unsupported electrical engineering. Not because ancient people lacked ingenuity. They clearly did not. But a claim of electricity comes with a burden. Show the circuit, not just the vessel. That missing piece matters more than the voltage ever did. You can generate current with a lemon and two metals. That does not make every lemon a machine. For the Baghdad jar to become evidence of ancient electrical technology, it would need companions, repeated cells with clear terminals, conductive links between them, a use case anchored to excavated objects, or some written trace showing the arrangement was intentional. Without that, the jar remains an object with a modern demonstration attached to it. Then, the record suffered a second wound. In April 2003, after Baghdad fell during the US-led invasion, the Iraq Museum was looted. Staff had left around April 8th. Over the next days, thousands of objects vanished, and the wider losses tied to the museum and Iraqi antiquities would be counted in the range of 7,000 to 10,000 still missing. The most famous battery in ancient history entered a new kind of darkness. Not the darkness of the Parthian past, but the modern kind. Broken inventories, incomplete documentation, vanished comparanda, interrupted custody. That loss changed the story in a quieter way. It made certainty harder for everyone. Believers could say modern institutions had mishandled the evidence. Skeptics could say the original claims had always rested on too little context. Both positions were partly right. That is exactly the kind of gap myths can live inside for decades. The jar did not need to produce much electricity. It only needed to produce enough ambiguity. So, what are we left with? A real artifact, a real vessel, real copper, real iron, real bitumen, a plausible date in the Parthian or early Sasanian world, and a modern reconstruction that can coax a faint electrical output from a design we may already be misreading. That is still a long way from proving a hidden technological lineage. It is even a long way from proving a battery in the ordinary sense. A battery is not just chemistry in a pot. It is chemistry connected to work. Picture a workshop 2,000 years ago. The jar sits on a bench. If it is truly electrical, something has to leave that jar and go somewhere. Into a wire, into a tool, into a process, into another cell chained beside it, into an object altered by current in a way no ordinary craft can fake. None of that comes with the famous image. What comes to us is the vessel itself, isolated and eerily familiar, like a key found with no lock. The copper cylinder is real. The iron rod is real. The acid in the replica can be real too. But the one thing that would turn resemblance into proof, a documented ancient circuit, has never been found. Number 10. Greek gears. In this wooden frame, there is enclosed a mass of corroded bronze and wood. That was how the first museum descriptions treated it, not as a marvel or a machine, but as a damaged lump from the sea. In spring 1900, sponge divers from Simi were blown off course near the small Greek island of Antikythera. They dropped into water that should have held nothing but rock and fish. Instead, they found a Roman-era wreck scattered with statues, glassware, coins, and bronze luxury cargo. The Greek Royal Navy joined the recovery in 1900 and 1901. It was dangerous, improvised work in heavy diving suits. One diver, Georgos Kritikos, died. 2 others came back paralyzed from decompression sickness. They were hauling up a ship's dead, piece by piece. The ugliest piece turned out to be the one that mattered most. At first, it barely competed for attention. Beside marble figures and bronze statues, this thing looked like a conservation headache. Salt, wood, mineral crust, a fused block. Nobody in Athens would have opened a crate and thought, here is a device that may force us to redraw the history of ancient technology. But sometime in 1902, archaeologist Valerio Stais looked closely at the broken bronze and noticed something impossible inside it. Teeth, not decorative notches, not random fracture lines. Gear teeth. The object changed in an instant. Junk became mechanism. A wreck find became a problem. Gears imply design. Design implies a maker. A maker implies a workshop that knew exactly what it was doing. This object presses on the old fantasy of a vanished super-civilization in a different way. If an advanced civilization had existed before recorded history, would we recognize its remains as artificial, or file them away as rocks and ritual objects? Here the answer was stranger. The artificial thing was already sitting in a museum. It was first recognized as junk because that is what it looked like. For decades, the lump stayed trapped inside that first impression. Scholars could tell it was unusual, but unusual is not the same as understood. Then one man pushed the case much further. Derek de Sola Price, a historian of science working in the mid-20th century, argued that the fragments came from a geared calendar computer. The phrase sounded almost reckless. Ancient Greek astronomy, yes. Mathematical theory, yes. But precision bronze gearing compacted into a hand-powered instrument? It sounded like the wrong artifact in the wrong century. Yet the more the fragments were studied, the less they behaved like anything simple. Here is the number that matters. The ancient computer was real enough to make the fake clues unnecessary. It does not prove a lost global civilization. It points the other way. The ancient world could produce something astonishing without help from Atlantis, aliens, or wishful thinking. The mechanism came out of a known human tradition: Greek mathematics, Greek astronomy, Greek craftsmanship. It reached such a level that later ages almost lost the category for it. Modern imaging broke it open. In 2006, high-resolution X-ray CT work published in Nature looked through the corrosion instead of merely at it. Researchers identified at least 30 surviving gear wheels. 30, inside what had once looked like a barnacled brick. They also doubled the amount of deciphered inscription compared with earlier work. The machine stopped being a vague curiosity and started speaking in parts, labels, instructions, and ratios. Now the hand that used it comes into view. You turn a small control. Inside, bronze teeth engage bronze teeth. Pointers move across dials. The sun advances. The moon shifts. Lunar phase changes on the front. On the back, spiral displays track the Metonic calendar cycle and the Saros cycle used for eclipse prediction. Later analysis showed it even pointed toward the schedule of Pan-Hellenic Games, including the Olympic Games. This was not an ornament pretending to be science. It was a calculator of cycles, built to compress the sky into a box small enough to carry. A hoax usually overacts. It gives you dinosaurs on carvings, batteries without wires, footprints in the wrong rock. This device does something more convincing. It arrives damaged, incomplete, embedded in ordinary history, and still overshoots our expectations. Even now, the original front display is not fully settled. In 2021, researchers at UCL proposed a full cosmos model that fits the known evidence and tries to reconstruct how the lost planetary displays may have worked. But some of that front face remains debated, because the sea kept too much of it. The mystery is no longer whether the mechanism was real. The question is, how much of its world is missing? One machine survived in fragments because a cargo ship sank near Antikythera. Machines like this do not appear alone. Someone had to conceive the gear trains. Someone had to cut the teeth. Someone had to engrave instructions. Someone had to expect a buyer who could use the thing. The strongest clue is not the object itself. It is the vanished workshop culture behind it, a whole chain of knowledge that left almost nothing else for us to hold. The final fact lands hard. The Antikythera Mechanism does not contain a handful of decorative cogs. It preserves at least 30 surviving gears from a hand-powered astronomical calculator built more than 2,000 years ago. Not a myth, not a fantasy precursor, a real machine from a real Greek tradition. One corroded lump held that much precision. Then it sat in plain sight, looking like wreckage. Number 9. The Coral City. The city rose where the streets should have been water. In 2019, an aircraft crossed the humid sky above Pohnpei, with a LiDAR scanner firing millions of laser pulses through the canopy. On the screen below, the island began to peel open. Ridges, terraces, walls, channels. Not one strange ruin in the mangroves, but an organized landscape spreading beyond what the eye could see from a boat. That changes how this place reads. If you look only at the surviving stone, Nan Madol can seem like an isolated marvel, as if it appeared out of nowhere. It did not. It stood at the edge of a larger system. Now come down from the aircraft to the reef flats off Temwen, on Pohnpei's southeast coast, in the late 1100s or early 1200s. The water is shallow, warm, bright over coral. Men wade where a capital is not supposed to be. They are not building on open ocean. They are packing coral rubble into a marine shelf. They are raising ground where there was almost none, turning tidal edges into foundations. One islet, then another, then another. More than 100 of them, linked by narrow canals where streets should have been water. By the time the complex reached its known form, there were around 130 stone buildings spread across this artificial maze. In one wall, a single dark basalt column juts out longer than the rest, wet at the edges, black against white coral fill. From a distance it looks almost simple. Up close it does not. A prismatic stone like a cut tree trunk, except it is lava. No mortar, just weight, balance, repetition. Nan Madol is often called a floating city, but that phrase is too gentle. This was engineered ground. Coral boulders below, basalt above. Labor everywhere. Archaeology places the main monumental building here around 770 to 750 years before present, roughly the 13th century CE. Oral tradition remembers the Saudeleur line ruling from this watery stronghold. It remembers something else, too. Two brothers, Olasipa and Olasopa, arriving by canoe and making the stones fly by sacred power. Myths like that are not engineering manuals. They usually gather around a real obstacle so large that ordinary explanation no longer feels like enough. You can see why. Stand inside Nandawas, the great mortuary islet, and walls rise around you in stacked courses of basalt columns, laid crisscross, log cabin style, one layer locking the next. The layout is ceremonial. It is also political. Building offshore impressed people, but it also separated rulers from everyone else. To reach authority, you approached by water. To move through the center, you passed through controlled channels. Geography became part of government. Beneath all of this is a larger question. When something artificial survives from deep time, do we recognize planning, labor, and power in the remains? Or do we flatten it into legend because the setting feels wrong? Nan Madol answers plainly. The place is real. The stonework is real. The organization behind it is real. None of this points to Atlantis. It points to a society in Micronesia, powerful enough to reorganize a shoreline into a ceremonial capital. The strangeness remains, but it changes shape. It gets narrower, more physical, more irritating. Stop asking who built it, and the problem shifts to how specific pieces got here at all. Take that one basalt column in the wall. Pohnpei is volcanic, so basalt itself is not the mystery. Columnar basalt forms naturally in long, prismatic shapes, almost as if geology briefly decided to imitate carpentry. But building with it on this scale meant selecting, moving, landing, and stacking pieces that weighed many tons in a place without cranes, steel cables, or engines. There are no surviving blueprints, no preserved hauling rigs, no written construction manual from a Saudeleur engineer calmly explaining the sequence. What remains is the finished fact, walls standing on artificial islets in the sea. For a long time, that fact invited the wrong kind of mystery. Lost continent, vanished superior race, outsiders. The usual cast appears whenever stone is heavy and islands are involved. Then the LiDAR work shifted the picture. It revealed features beyond the famous ruins and tied Nan Madol to a broader archaeological landscape of walls, terraces, and human modification inland as well as offshore. The city stopped looking like an impossible object. It started looking like the ceremonial apex of a managed environment. That sharper picture makes Nandao's harder in one precise way. The basalt in those elite walls was not necessarily taken from the nearest convenient outcrop. Chemical studies have traced some columns to quarries at Sokez, on the other side of Pohnpei, more than 25 miles away, over water, through an island environment that could help with flotation, tides, and canoe transport, but only if somebody already knew how to coordinate all of it at scale. Not one stone, not a lucky drift. Repeated movement, repeated placement, repeated control. So go back to that single column in the wall. Its corners catch the light. Coral is packed beneath it. Beyond it, the canal sits green and still. You can picture men guiding a load over shallow reef, timing water, balance, muscle. But the apparatus that made that scene possible is gone. No raft survives, no lifting frame, no line of rollers waiting in the mud, only the column. Hauled more than 25 miles to a tomb islet on the reef flats, stacked into place. The transport system is gone. Number 8. The fitted wall. In May 1536, the hill north of Cusco became the most expensive ground in the Andes. Manco Inca had escaped Spanish control, returned with a rebel army, and seized Sacsayhuamán above the city. From below, the Spaniards looked up at 3 great zigzag walls and stonework so tight that later visitors would claim a knife blade could not pass between the blocks. The wall looks poured, but hands cut it. Juan Pizarro led the assault uphill. He was not attacking a dead ruin. He was climbing toward a working stronghold of terraces, towers, and defended masonry that dominated Cusco from above. Spanish accounts call the fight desperate, because it was. Whoever held that hill could squeeze the city beneath it. Juan Pizarro helped retake Sacsayhuamán, but he was fatally wounded in the fighting. The place he died attacking would outlive the empire that built it. Here the myth breaks from the record. The myth says these stones are too large, too irregular, too perfectly fitted to belong to the Inca at all. The record says the Spaniards who first saw them during the conquest did not describe alien leftovers or the work of some vanished pre-human race. They described Inca power, imperial power, recent enough to fight over in 1536, and strong enough that taking it cost blood. The knife blade gap works because the image is true to the eye. Stand in front of those walls, and the joints look less built than fused. Some of the limestone blocks weigh well over 100 tons. Estimates for the largest run roughly from 128 to 200 tons. They are polygonal, stacked without mortar. Their faces bent around one another in a pattern that looks less like masonry than cooled wax. That visual effect keeps pulling Sacsayhuamán into stories about lost, superior builders. It looks like the kind of thing people might misfile as geology if they arrive too late to see the workers. But the historical explanation is not, people with rope did a miracle, and then everyone walked away. In practice, it is stranger because it runs on scale. Chronicler Bernabe Kobo gave a figure of around 30,000 laborers connected to the building of Sacsayhuamán. The number may be approximate, but the logic matters. This was not a puzzle solved by one secret machine. It was labor concentrated by a state in the 15th century, under rulers associated with the Great Inca expansion, Pachacuti, Topa Inca Yupanqui, Huayna Capac. Not a lost civilization hiding before history, a known civilization with the authority to command stone, food, roads, quarrying, transport, and time. Time matters because the walls create the wrong impression. They look instantaneous, one perfect final surface. But fitted masonry is slow. Quarry a block, rough shape it, drag it, lift it, offer it to the growing wall. See where it binds, pull it back, peck away high spots with hammerstones, set it again, test again, shape again. A perfect seam is not one decision, it is repetition made visible. That explanation sounds almost disappointingly human until you look at what survived. After the conquest, Sacsayhuamán was not left alone because it was too mysterious to touch. It was dismantled because it was too useful not to be. Colonial builders treated it as a quarry. We know that from documented contracts in 1559 and 1646. Stones were hauled downhill into Spanish Cusco to build churches, houses, and civic buildings. So the site we photograph today is not the complete original complex. It is the part the victors could not cheaply steal. That fact changes the emotional effect of the place. What looks like a shattered relic from a forgotten age is partly the skeleton left behind by demolition. The smaller, more manageable stones vanished into the colonial city. The biggest blocks remained because moving them was a bad bargain even for conquerors who wanted the material. The giant stones survived not because nobody knew what they were, but because everyone knew exactly what they were worth. There is still room for uncertainty, but it is narrower than the myth allows. Archaeologists do debate parts of the construction sequence across sectors. There were pre-imperial occupations in the wider area, including Kilki period settlement, and not every wall and terrace necessarily belongs to one single moment. But that is not the same as claiming an erased high civilization before recorded history. The broad picture holds. The monumental complex overlooking Cusco is associated with Inca imperial construction, and the surviving zigzag terraces are the visible core of that program. So why does the wall still look poured? Because good stonework preserves the final fit and erases the failed attempts. You do not see the quarry marks that were cut away. You do not see crews levering a block a few inches, checking a joint, lowering it, and dressing one face again. You do not see the political machine that fed workers, organized labor, and kept thousands of people moving toward one design. That system collapsed. The seams stayed. By 1983, when the city of Cusco and its major Inca remains were inscribed by UNESCO, Sacsayhuamán had long since become both monument and argument. To some eyes, it still looked too exact to be human. The closer record says the opposite. The Spanish attacked it as an Inca fortress in 1536. Colonial Cusco cannibalized it, stone by stone after the conquest. The famous knife blade fit does not point to a vanished builder hidden behind the Inca. It points to repeated shaping, repeated testing, repeated labor on a hill above Cusco, until a wall made by hands looked, at the finished joint, as if it had simply hardened there. Number 7. The machine stones. One block is enough to start the argument. An andesite H stone, cut with straight inner corners, flat faces, and channels that look almost machined. It sits at Puma Punku, on the Bolivian Altiplano, nearly 3,850 meters above sea level, about 70 kilometers from La Paz, in thin air, where even walking feels expensive. The claim attached to it is always the same. Angles this sharp, surfaces this even, repetition this tight. Surely that means saws, drills, power tools, something more than stone, hammer, and patience. But Puma Punku does not give you one neat wall still standing. It gives you a debris field, red sandstone slabs, andesite blocks, broken joints, carved channels, pieces scattered across a protected area of about 7 hectares on the western side of Tiwanaku, near the southern shore of Lake Titicaca. The largest slab is usually given at about 7.8 meters long, 5.2 wide, and 1.1 thick. Before you even ask who cut the H block, a more immediate problem appears. Who moved any of this here, on a treeless plateau, into a ceremonial complex that reached its apogee roughly between 500 and 900 CE? People keep treating Puma Punku like a machine shop because the place hits you with numbers first. Altitude, 3,850 meters. Weight, multi-ton blocks, with one giant slab lying like a capsized floor panel. Distance, not just carving stone but sourcing it, hauling it, lifting it, setting it into a platform faced with red sandstone and fitted with andesite inserts. Then the finish, grooves that run clean, corners that seem too square, repeating forms that make the mind jump straight to templates, metal, motors. If an advanced civilization really existed before recorded history, this is exactly the kind of place people would point to. But the dating does not cooperate with that story. Deep in the mound fill at Puma Punku, a radiocarbon sample is often cited at about 1510 plus or minus 25 years before present, calibrating roughly to the 6th century CE. That does not date every visible stone directly. Archaeology rarely hands you a receipt that neat. But it places the construction sequence inside the first millennium, with the monumental stone architecture later than the fill beneath it, not in some vanished ice age. The site looks like the remains of a lost world. The chronology points to state builders in the Andes already at work there. The ruin itself helps sell the illusion. Spanish chroniclers and later travelers did not arrive at a pristine ceremonial sector. They found collapse, robbing, rearrangement, stone taken away, architecture reduced to fragments. You were looking at parts without the structure they belonged to. A precision cut gets isolated from the wall that once explained it. An unanswered logistical step grows into fantasy. In a standing wall, a groove is part of a system. In a field of ruins, it turns into a clue ripped out of its sentence. Archaeologists who returned to Puma Punku in the 20th and 21st centuries worked in the other direction. They moved from pieces to plan. Alexei Vranich and others treated the complex less like a legend and more like a dismantled build. They mapped the blocks, excavated the mound, identified construction fills, tracked joints, drains, sockets, surfaces. The image stays cinematic. Stones scattered like a wrecked kit of parts. But the method changes what those stones are allowed to mean. They stop serving as props for a missing civilization and start behaving like the remains of Tiwanaku engineering. The hardest part is still logistics. Even when Puma Punku is placed firmly inside the Tiwanaku world, the full operational sequence for the biggest blocks is only partly reconstructed. Quarrying is one challenge. Transport over high-altitude ground is another. Lifting and positioning those masses into an artificial platform is another again. One detail keeps pulling people back. Some of the andesite pieces look standardized, as if they were produced to fit into a larger modular design. Not modern, not impossible, but organized at a scale that demanded labor, planning, routes, authority, and time. The human cost sits in the fill as well. One individual, labeled TW059, was found face down in construction deposits at Puma Punku and has been interpreted as a possible sacrifice linked to a major platform modification. Face down in the fill inside the work of building. So this was not just a yard full of clever stone cutting. It was a political and ritual project. It could mobilize bodies, reshape ground, and fold death into construction. The question of how Puma Punku was made is not only about tools, it is also about a state-level system powerful enough to make precision happen again and again. And yes, the tool mark debate is real. Some viewers see saw cuts, others see pecking, grinding, abrasion, finishing, and damage accumulated across centuries of exposure and breakage. The surviving surfaces are not neutral witnesses. Many are chipped, weathered, or torn out of context. Survival bias matters here. The most striking blocks are the ones cameras return to, because they preserve the cleanest geometry. Failed cuts, rough transitions, and removed surfaces do not get equal billing. Good stonework, once broken apart, can look less like masonry than manufacture. By 2000, Tiwanaku was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and newer work, including drone and remote sensing surveys, began finding more of the buried system around the monumental core. Traces of roads, canals, ditches, circular and rectangular structures, even the outline of a hidden stone temple. Puma Punku was never a pile of inexplicable masterpieces dropped onto empty ground. It belonged to a wider built landscape. So go back to that first H block. Do its angles require power tools? The quiet answer is no. They require skill, abrasion, measurement, repetition, and a social machine large enough to support all of that at nearly 3,850 meters. One fact remains. We still do not have a complete eyewitness sequence for how the largest stones were quarried, hauled, raised, and locked into place. Number 6. The Hidden Voids. On November 2, 2017, a paper in Nature announced that particles born in the upper atmosphere had passed through the Great Pyramid of Khufu and mapped a space no one had known was there. Not light, not radar alone. Muons, cosmic ray byproducts falling through stone by the billions. Most die in rock. A few survive long enough to leave a count. Put a detector behind enough masonry, and shortages and excesses begin to draw an outline. That was the premise. The claim was harder. Inside the most studied pyramid on Earth, built during Khufu's reign around 2509 to 2483 BC, there was a hidden void at least 30 meters long. It sounds like one more secret chamber headline. The document trail is what sets this one apart. In October 2015, the Scan Pyramids mission began under Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities, with researchers from Egypt, Japan, France, and Canada. They did not start by drilling. They treated the pyramid like a sealed patient. First came infrared thermography on the north and east faces, measuring where the stone released heat unevenly. On the north face, above the original entrance, sits a set of chevron-shaped blocks. There, the thermal pattern broke expectation. Stones that should have behaved like ordinary masonry did not. The anomaly got a second look, then a third. Kunihiro Morishima's group at Nagoya University placed muon detectors inside the pyramid, with additional systems from KEK and France's CEA. 3 different muon technologies were used: nuclear emulsion films, scintillator hodoscopes, and gas detectors. Different hardware, different teams, same principle. Count the particles that make it through. Compare them with what solid limestone should allow. Whatever lets through too many muons is not ordinary dense stone. You are inside the pyramid now, in one of the spaces people can actually enter. There are only 3 main internal chambers in the standard layout: the subterranean chamber, the so-called Queen's Chamber, and the King's Chamber. Beyond them are passageways, relieving spaces, and the steep Grand Gallery. Tourists know the monument as ancient but mapped. Sealed, yes. Mysterious, obviously, but basically known. The detector counts broke that picture. By 2017, the 3 independent muon systems had converged on the same result: a large void above or near the Grand Gallery, with a minimum length of 30 meters. Not a hairline crack, not a pocket. 30 meters turns an irregularity into architecture, even if no one can yet say what kind. The paper stayed careful. It did not call it a burial chamber. It did not fill it with relics. It used the word the data could support: a void. That word split the debate in 2. Egyptologists argued over whether it might be a construction gap, a relieving space, an unfinished corridor, a structural feature no one had predicted, or an artifact of interpretation. A muon map is not a photograph. It shows where matter is missing, or thinner than expected. It does not give you a doorway, an inscription, or a clean floor plan. For people hunting a lost civilization, that made the result both solid and incomplete. A second thread of the story was unfolding lower down, back at the chevrons on the north face, where this had started. From 2016 to 2022, that area was examined again and again with infrared, muography, ground-penetrating radar, ultrasound, and 3D architectural simulation. Popular retellings keep blending the discoveries together, as if the pyramid produced one giant mystery blob. It did not. The big void near the Grand Gallery was one problem. The north face anomaly behind the chevrons was another. Separate target, separate evidence chain, same monument. For years, the north face anomaly remained a suspicion, a place where heat behaved wrong, a place where signals refused to settle down, the kind of thing that can disappear under better measurement. This one did not. It narrowed. In March 2023, Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities unveiled what that anomaly had become: a hidden corridor behind the chevrons, physically imaged and confirmed. 9 meters long, about 2.1 meters wide, a real architectural space, sitting behind the north face where the earlier thermal scans had first hinted that the masonry was not telling the full truth. This did not solve the big void. It did confirm the method. A heat irregularity became a survey target. The target survived radar and ultrasound. Then it became a corridor you could actually image. So when critics said the larger muon anomaly might be methodological noise, the pyramid answered with a smaller hidden structure, found by the same logic. Not proof of a forgotten super-civilization, not treasure room fan fiction. Proof that the building still contains unmapped architecture. That bears directly on the larger question running underneath all of this. If something artificial came from a world we do not fully recognize, would we know what we were looking at? At Giza, the first clue was not a carved inscription or a dramatic doorway. It was a mismatch in heat. Then, a surplus of invisible particles crossing 2.3 million blocks of stone. The room we can see but still cannot enter is the big void. We know where the muons place it. We do not know its entrance, contents, or purpose. What we do know is narrower and harder. In the Great Pyramid, after centuries of study, scans found one hidden corridor behind the north face chevrons, measuring 9 meters by 2.1, and one separate void near the Grand Gallery, at least 30 meters long. Number 5. The Buried Hill. In October 2023, a hill in West Java stopped being just a hill. On its summit sat terraces of dark, upright, andesite columns. The stonework already looked half-built by nature and half-finished by human hands. Beneath it, one set of dates reached far deeper than the visible monument above. A mountain like that invites a specific mistake. If it seems to hide architecture, the oldest number in the ground starts to feel like the oldest part of the structure. Gunung Padang may be a pyramid, or it may be a lesson in how badly people want one. On October 20th, 2023, Indonesian geologist Danny Hilman Natawijaja and his co-authors published a paper in Archaeological Prospection. The claim was built to explode across the lost civilization internet. Gunung Padang, near Cianjur, was not merely a megalithic terrace complex on a volcanic hill. It was a buried, multi-layered prehistoric pyramid, not exposed on a desert plain, hidden inside a mountain. Some of its construction phases, they argued, might reach back roughly 9,000 to 25,000 years. That age range rewrites the timeline in a single stroke. 25,000 years takes you deep into the last ice age, a span from about 115,000 to 11,700 years ago. It puts possible construction not before the Egyptians, not before Stonehenge, but before farming as we usually tell the story, before pottery cities, before metal, before almost every monument that makes people comfortable using the word civilization. The image almost builds itself, a stepped summit, buried layers, geophysical surveys suggesting internal zones and possible void-like features. A volcanic hill that could, under one interpretation, be less landscape than shell, and under that shell sat the oldest number in the story. The actual argument was much narrower than the headlines. No one was arguing over whether Gunung Padang exists. It does. No one was arguing over whether people used the site in the past. They did. The fight was over what, exactly, those deep dates belonged to. Critics moved fast because the leap was enormous. Archaeologists and dating specialists pointed out that radiocarbon dating does not date civilization as a category. It dates organic material, charcoal, soil carbon, fragments of once living matter. If that material comes from a sealed hearth under a built floor, the date can be tied to human activity. If it comes from a layer with no secure artifact, no constructed surface, no cut stone in place, no burial, no tool, no unmistakable sign of work, then the test may have dated the age of material in the ground and nothing more. That sounds technical until you stand on the slope and picture the cut in the earth. A volcanic hill is full of complications. Natural fractures, natural deposits, water movement, roots, older carbon, younger intrusion. A deep sample comes back old, very old. But an old number below a monument is not automatically the age of the monument, because the hill was there before anyone built on it. Gunung Padang was almost perfectly built to blur that line. The visible summit really is striking. Terraces, retaining features, clusters of columnar stone set in patterns that look deliberate, because many of them are deliberate. The site matters even without Ice Age headlines. Some archaeologists have pointed to evidence of human presence by the 12th to 13th centuries CE, including ceramics from upper layers. Others have placed visible megalithic construction earlier, in the 2nd to 5th centuries CE, or suggested use in the 6th to 8th centuries. Those ranges do not make the site trivial. They make it archaeological. They also leave a giant gap between accepted surface history and the buried ages that made the paper famous. One of the sharpest responses came from archaeologists, focusing on what was missing in the period the claim implied. Bill Farley argued there is no evidence for human settlement at Gunung Padang during that Ice Age window. That mattered because the paper's public life was driven by a very specific image, not a significant hilltop sanctuary in Indonesian history, but an engineered pyramid from a civilization older than known civilization. The whole case depended on turning deep antiquity into deep construction. What, exactly, had been dated? Not carved andesite blocks, not a staircase, not a laid floor, not an inscription. Not a burial sealed inside masonry, not a cache of tools trapped within a built wall. The disputed ancient dates came from soil and organic material in subsurface layers. Critics said those layers were not securely tied to human-made structures or artifacts. The oldest number was real as a measurement. The problem was the story attached to it. By early 2024, that distinction had become the whole incident. Specialists in geophysics, archaeology, and radiocarbon dating challenged the paper's interpretation. In March 2024, Wiley retracted it, stating that the conclusions were unsupported. Gunung Padang did not vanish with the retraction. The terraces were still there. The hill was still there. The unresolved subsurface anomalies were still there. But the most sensational version of the site had collapsed into a harsher, simpler fact. The famous 9,000 to 25,000 year ages were dates on organic material in deep layers beneath a real megalithic hilltop site, not secure dates for the construction of an Ice Age pyramid. Number 4. The underwater steps. So move that uncertainty offshore, where the hill becomes a cliff and the cliff drops under clear blue water. In 1986, diving guide Kihachiro Aratake was scouting the sea off the south shore of Yonaguni, Japan's westernmost island, about 75 miles from Taiwan's east coast, when the bottom suddenly stopped looking like the bottom. Below him was a broad platform of stone cut into terraces, edges, and long, flat faces. One ledge dropped to another. Corners met at angles that looked too clean. A wall seemed to rise out of the reef. In water bright enough to read shape at a glance, it looked less like a reef than the top of something built. He had gone out looking for hammerhead shark spots. Instead, he found a staircase under the ocean that may not lead anywhere. People have been stuck on Yonaguni ever since. The main formation runs about 100 meters by 60 and stands roughly 25 meters tall. The larger area some researchers map around it stretches to around 300 by 150. Those are not pebbles and wishful thinking. They are the dimensions of a place you can swim along like a street. You pass terraces. You pass what looks like a broad plaza. You look down a sharp edge and your brain fills in the rest. Human beings are extremely good at seeing intention in straight lines. By the 1990s, marine geologist Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus had spent years diving and mapping the site. By 2007, he said he had studied it for more than 15 years, and his claim went far beyond the usual mysterious pyramid language. He argued that parts of Yonaguni were not merely suggestive. He believed he saw quarry marks, etched characters, animal-like carvings. Not just a formation that resembles architecture, but a structure worked by human hands, damaged by earthquakes, and later drowned as sea levels rose after the Ice Age. If that were true, the implication would be enormous. Not because Yonaguni would suddenly prove some vanished global supercivilization. It would not. It would answer a smaller, harder question running through all of this. If something artificial survives deep enough in time, would we even recognize it? Or would we file it away as rock? Yonaguni gives both sides something to point at. Swim past one face and it seems cut. Drift over another and it looks stacked. A right angle appears. Then a channel. Then a shelf like a landing. Closer in, the stone breaks in big geometric planes, almost as if blocks were once fitted together, and the seams widened with age. For believers, the shapes pile up into a city. For skeptics, the same shapes pile up into a trap. Somewhere in the middle of this story, Yonaguni earns its place on the list, underwater steps that may not lead anywhere at all. Another diver can enter the same water, follow the same terraces, and come back with a completely different reading. Robert Schoch, among others, argued that the monument's sharp forms do not require lost engineers. They require sandstone laid in beds, sandstone fractured by joints and faults, sandstone in a tectonically active region, then exposed to waves and erosion that exploit every weakness already in the rock. In that reading, Yonaguni is dramatic, but not mysterious in the way people want. The plains are natural bedding surfaces. The edges are fracture lines. The apparent staircases are what happen when layered stone breaks cleanly. Underwater, geometry feels intentional. It always has. We build with flat surfaces and corners, so when nature produces them at large scale, your first instinct is architecture. But geology can make forms that look designed, especially in a place like Yonaguni, where the rock is heavily jointed and the earth does not sit still politely in the background. The island knows violence. In 1771, the tsunami that struck Yonaguni was estimated at more than 40 meters high. This is a coastline shaped by force. So the argument is not between imagination and science. It is between two scientific readings of the same visual evidence. One says the shape is too organized to be accidental, especially if the markings Kimura identified are real. The other says that organization is exactly what fractured sedimentary rock can look like, and that the supposed marks and carvings have never produced the kind of direct proof that would end the debate. No inscription accepted by specialists, no tool definitively tied to construction. No artifact bed nobody can wave away, just stone, scale, and resemblance. That part matters more than it seems. Earlier sites in this story at least give you human debris to argue over. Tools, walls, dates, cultural layers. Yonaguni gives you almost none of that comfort. It is mostly a visual case, a monument by silhouette, and silhouettes are where lost civilization stories thrive, because the eye reaches certainty long before the evidence does. By late afternoon, the water off Yonaguni goes glassy in the footage. Light strips across the terraces. The edges soften as the sun angle drops. What looked at noon like a drowned platform starts to look again like bedrock. No doorway opens, no inscription resolves. The staircase remains where Aratake saw it in 1986, descending through blue water into shadow, not necessarily to a city, not even necessarily to human history, just stone, holding its shape. Number 3. The Drowned Country. The country that disappeared without needing a myth. In January 1931, the British trawler Kalinda was working the Lehman and Ower Bank, about 40 kilometers off the Norfolk coast. Something hard came up in the net with the rest of the seabed trash. Not shell, not stone. A barbed point carved from antler. Human-made, old enough to belong to the Mesolithic, old enough that it had no business lying on the floor of the North Sea at all. The crew had not gone looking for archaeology. They were dragging for fish. The deck would have been wet, cold, routine, until this old worked point appeared among mud and debris, and the sea kept handing them pieces of a place nobody living had seen. Over the years, it was not just that one point. Fishermen and dredging crews brought up mammoth bones, aurochs, red deer, worked flint, fragments of antler, and traces of an extinct landscape from the same drowned plain. The finds were scattered, accidental, irritatingly incomplete, but they pointed in the same direction. The bottom of the North Sea had once been dry ground, inhabited ground, crossed by people who left tools behind and never came back for them. One object in a net can be a curiosity. A pattern lasting decades is something else. If an advanced civilization really existed before recorded history, this is the test. Would we recognize its remains as artificial, or would we file them away as fishing bycatch, bones, and mud? The person who helps make that pattern visible is not a king or an explorer planting a flag. It is an archaeologist staring at evidence that arrived out of order. Vince Gaffney of the University of Bradford spent years working with data never meant to resurrect a vanished country. Oil and gas surveys, seismic lines, industrial mapping of the seabed, information collected to find resources, lay cables, and plan offshore work. Buried inside those scans was topography. River channels, low hills, basins, estuaries, the shape of a real landscape now underwater. By around 9,000 years ago, Britain was still connected to continental Europe. You could have walked east from what is now Norfolk into a low world of marshes, lagoons, river valleys, and hunting grounds that stretched toward the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and Denmark. It was not a lost city. It was larger than that, and stranger in a way cities are not. A whole country without walls, a lived-in plain where Mesolithic people moved with the seasons, followed game, fished the shallows, cut antler and wood, and watched the shoreline keep changing. Archaeologists gave it a modern name much later, Doggerland, after Dogger Bank. Maps of post-Ice Age sea level rise make the violence look clean. Colored bands creep inland, coastlines retreat, land becomes shoal, then island, then memory. Real drowning is messier. As the ice sheets melted, the sea did not simply arrive one morning and erase the map. It gnawed. It flooded river mouths, turned meadows into wetlands, broke ridges into coasts, and converted familiar routes into channels. Around 7,500 BCE, the land connection between Britain and Northwest Europe was largely severed. Nobody drew a border. The ground itself had been shrinking for generations. Doggerland is unnerving because it is confirmed, not alleged. Not one suspicious carving or one photogenic formation on a sea floor. A known world, inhabited by known humans, removed by known processes. Most of its archive was found by accident. The sea floor became a storage vault nobody built, Trawlers tore through it. Dredges bit into it. Wind farm surveys crossed it. Industry, not archaeology, kept opening the drawers. So the evidence reaches us in a peculiar register. Not monuments, but leftovers. Not temples, but antler points and animal bones. Material a future observer could easily misread if they were expecting grand ruins and dressed stone. There are analogues for what this drowned world can preserve. In Wismar Bay, archaeologists found submerged Mesolithic sites, dating between about 8,800 and 5,500 years ago, including 39 human footprints. Not myths, footprints. Steps taken on ground that later went under. That shows what coastal submergence can hide in plain sight. Not just objects, but moments. A person crossing wet sediment, a settlement edge, a hunting stop, a shoreline camp. Doggerland almost certainly held thousands of such traces. Most remain buried under the busiest sea in Europe. Then came the blow people remember. Around 6,200 BCE, off the coast of Norway, a colossal submarine landslide called Storegga collapsed into the North Atlantic. The sea answered with a tsunami that crossed the North Sea basin. A 2021 review looked at 145 tsunami deposits and attributed 67 of them to Storegga, making it one of the best documented ancient tsunami events in the Atlantic world. It sounds decisive. One wave, one end, a clean disaster. The evidence does not stay that neat. Some researchers argue the tsunami delivered the final shock to a landscape already failing. Others suggest parts of the Dogger Bank region may have survived after the wave, perhaps even into the Neolithic. So this homeland did not vanish in a single cinematic instant. It narrowed, fractured, flooded, retreated, and then, at some point, became uninhabitable, not everywhere at once, but in pieces. First a plain, then wetlands, then islands, then a broken archipelago waiting for the next storm. Imagine standing there near the end. You know the paths between camps. You know where the fresh water sits, where the deer pass, where the ground stays firm after rain. But the channels are wider this year. The edges are softer. Salt reaches farther inland. A place that held together in your grandparents' time now comes apart under your feet. Then a wall of water arrives from the north. Even if it does not erase everything in one day, it ends the illusion that this country is stable. So the antler point from the Kalinda was not dragged from some isolated wreck of human activity. It came from a land bridge, from the drowned floor of the country that once joined Britain to Europe. By the time the net closed around it in 1931, that country had been gone for roughly 9,000 years. Number 2. Before the village. Autumn, 1994. On a limestone ridge about 15 kilometers northeast of Shanli-Urfa, Klaus Schmidt stood over a hill other people had walked past and mostly dismissed. Stones pushed through the surface. Flint glittered in the dust. Beneath that ordinary mound, the tops of buried T-shaped pillars were already waiting, as if an entire stone world had been forced back into the earth on purpose. The temple that arrived before the city was not supposed to exist. Schmidt, a German archaeologist born in 1953, had worked at earlier Neolithic sites in the region. So on this ridge in southeastern Turkey, he did not see medieval rubble. He saw cut limestone. He saw alignments no random collapse should make. He saw the crest of something much older. Excavations began in 1995. The hill opened slowly. Then it stopped looking like a hill at all. What came out of the ground was a set of circular and oval enclosures, built around giant limestone pillars, shaped like the letter T. Some rose to roughly 5.5 meters high, taller than a room, too large to ignore as mere boundary stones or grave markers. In the best-known rings, two taller central pillars faced each other. Smaller ones stood around the inner edge like a silent assembly. Foxes ran across them. Snakes crawled over them. Boars, birds, and abstract marks cut into the stone caught light and shadow differently as the sun moved. On some pillars, human-like arms and hands descended along the sides. These monuments date to roughly 9,600 to 8,200 BCE, in the pre-pottery Neolithic, thousands of years before writing and long before cities appear in the usual schoolbook order. At first, the shock was simple. Monumental architecture this early should not have been there. Then the discovery became more dangerous. If the pillars were really that old, the standard sequence many archaeologists had relied on did not just need a footnote, it needed surgery. The familiar ladder ran upward in tidy steps. Farming first, permanent villages after that, surpluses after that, then specialists, then monuments. But on this ridge stood quarried stone circles that suggested planning, labor, and shared symbols before the old model allowed them. Either the date was misleading, or the model was. The most famous enclosure, Enclosure D, spans about 30 meters across. Standing inside it is the part numbers alone cannot capture. 30 meters means no one person could hold the whole arrangement in hand or memory without planning. The two central pillars dominate the space. The surrounding ring fixes attention on them. Recent academic discussion has centered one radiocarbon estimate for that phase at around 9,530, plus or minus 215 BCE. Not a magic birthday for the whole site. Not the single moment everything appeared. But when that date held, layer after layer of comfortable explanation started to fail. People once cast as small, mobile bands were apparently quarrying, shaping, hauling, and raising multi-ton pillars into prepared sockets on a prominent ridge. That was when the first clean solution arrived. Temple before farming, religion before the village. The phrase was irresistible because it sounded like a complete reversal. First came the shrine, then settlement gathered around sacred stone. For a while, Gobekli Tepe was told that way, an isolated ritual center built by hunter-gatherers before agriculture had fully transformed the region. Then the site began resisting even that dramatic version. Nearby early Neolithic sites in southeastern Anatolia complicated the picture. Evidence from the broader landscape hinted at domestic life, resource management, and communities that were not as neatly separate from ritual as the slogan required. Schmidt and later archaeologists were no longer looking at one impossible sanctuary floating above ordinary life. They were looking at a networked world in which the line between gathering place, working landscape, and settlement kept dissolving. The deeper the excavation went, the less the old categories held. Monumental spaces were not appearing at the end of a social process everyone understood. They were part of the process itself. If that interpretation shifted, textbooks would have to do more than move one date backward. They would have to rethink what coordinated labor actually depended on. Maybe permanent hierarchy was not the only engine. Maybe repeated gathering, memory, feasting, obligation, and competition could organize major building projects before cities, kings, and writing ever arrived. The labor alone forced that question. Limestone had to be quarried directly from bedrock. Pillars weighing several tons had to be shaped with stone tools, dragged across the site, and lifted upright. At 5.5 meters tall, a pillar is not just a statistic. It is a demand for crews, leverage, timing, and the kind of cooperation that fails visibly if even part of it breaks down. The carvings were deliberate and repeated, not casual scratches. Someone chose those animals. Someone repeated those forms. Someone expected the space to mean something to people who entered it. You can see why the pillars invited bigger myths. They are abstract enough to resist certainty. Some look almost human. The T-shape may represent stylized bodies. On a few pillars, belts, hands, and loincloth-like details strengthen that reading. But are these gods, ancestors, masked figures, rival groups, or something else entirely? There is no inscription waiting to settle the argument. No priestly manual. No caption in the stone. Each enclosure solved one problem and opened another. Even the hill itself refused to stay simple. Those pillars Schmidt first noticed were buried because much of the site was later filled in after use. Popular retellings turned that into a single ceremonial ceiling, a dramatic prehistoric cover-up. The excavation record is less theatrical and more troubling. Some fill deposits may reflect abandonment, rebuilding, erosion, clearing episodes, or ordinary site management over long spans of time, rather than one final act. That changed the question again. If enclosures were packed with debris, stone, and refuse at different times, and in different ways, then the mound was not preserving a message from one vanished moment. It was recording repeated decisions by people who kept altering what came before. By the time UNESCO inscribed Gobekli Tepe on the World Heritage List in 2018, the site had already forced archaeology to accept the shock. But acceptance did not bring closure. It only made the contradictions official. The pillars were early. The labor was real. The imagery was intentional. The fill was complicated. And once those facts stood together, the next problem was harder than the first. If this ridge was not an anomaly, what else in the 10th millennium BCE have we been misreading because we were still expecting civilization to announce itself in a later language? Number 1. The layer after us. If we vanished and gave the planet 10 million years, what would be left that still looked like us? Not our names, not our flags, probably not a single standing city. A future geologist would cut into a cliff, hit a thin, strange band in the rock, and have to decide: industry or just another planetary convulsion? In 2018, NASA climate scientist Gavin A. Schmidt and University of Rochester astrophysicist Adam Frank took that question and made it brutally practical. The paper sounded like a joke at first. They called it the Silurian Hypothesis, borrowing the name from Doctor Who, where the Silurians were fictional, intelligent reptiles. The joke stopped there. Their real question was colder than any lost world story. If an industrial civilization had risen on Earth millions of years before us, would we know how to detect it? They were careful from the start. They were not arguing that such a civilization existed. They said the opposite. There is no accepted evidence for one. That was never the point. The point was detection. What survives when time turns geological? Almost nothing people usually picture. Skyscrapers collapse, steel rusts, glass weathers, roads crack, sink, and disappear. Bones are rare already. Machines last even less. Give erosion, burial, metamorphism, and plate tectonics enough time, and most artifacts become dust, then chemistry, then nothing. So Schmidt and Frank started with the only industrial civilization they could actually study: ours. They used the Anthropocene as a forensic template. If someone came after us far in the future, they would not identify humanity from a door hinge or a satellite dish. They would identify us from a signal stamped across the whole planet. A carbon isotope shift from burning fossil fuels fast, warming, ocean acidification, a disturbed nitrogen cycle, disrupted phosphorus, layers carrying aluminum, concrete, plastics, soot from fossil fuel particulates, heavy metals, artificial radionuclides. No ruin competes with that. The planet itself remembers the industry. Now stand in that future trench. You are not hunting for a temple wall. You are reading a planetary lab report. A truly industrial civilization does not just build. It alters the air, the water, the sediments, the biosphere. It leaves a pulse. Then Schmidt and Frank made the problem harder, because Earth has produced pulses before. About 56 million years ago, near the boundary known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, the planet lurched into a rapid warming event. Carbon flooded into the atmosphere and oceans. Temperatures rose. Chemistry shifted. The rocks still carry the scar as a carbon isotope anomaly. Set that ancient disturbance beside the kind of disturbance our own civilization is creating, and the resemblance gets uncomfortable. Not identical, close enough to matter. This is where the old dream of a lost civilization collides with actual stone. It is not enough to ask whether something strange happened. Plenty of strange things happened. You have to ask whether the rocks can separate a short industrial episode, lasting centuries or millennia, from natural carbon releases caused by volcanism, methane, or organic-rich sediments cooking underground. Sometimes the honest answer is simple: not easily. That matters because deep time does not preserve the past like a library. It shreds it. Sedimentary layers are incomplete. Ocean crust gets recycled. Whole landscapes are erased. Even a civilization with global reach might survive as a geochemical hiccup, only centimeters thick, scattered, altered, and hard to date cleanly. Abundant fossil carbon has existed on Earth since at least the Carboniferous, roughly 350 million years ago, so the fuel was there. The issue is not whether ancient industry had something to burn. The issue is whether, after hundreds of millions of years, any burn still looks artificial. So the clue is not a city under the jungle or a machine on the seabed. It is thinner than that, colder than that, less cinematic. If an advanced civilization really existed before recorded history, we might not recognize its remains as artificial at all. We might file them away as chemistry. Schmidt and Frank's answer was narrow and unsettling. Only a planet-scale change that outlasted stone would stand much chance. That leaves no monument. It leaves a checklist. Not columns, not carved blocks, a layer. A future geologist looking for us in ancient rock would search for abrupt carbon isotope excursions, consistent with rapid fossil fuel combustion, for disturbances in nitrogen and phosphorus cycling, for ocean acidification written into marine sediments, for unusual concentrations of synthetic materials or their breakdown products, for heavy metals moved and concentrated far beyond ordinary background patterns, for artificial radionuclides, if any could survive in daughter signatures, for extinction pulses and invasive species reshuffling, for soot, ash, and the mineral scars of mining on a continental scale. And if they ever found that combination deep in strata far older than humanity, the strangest part would be this: they might never find a single ruin to go with it. Just a narrow band in stone, a chemical whisper. The builder's gone. The building's gone too.